I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Weber. Mike is a popular returning speaker for the museum, and he has a long history and love of Cornwall. As a child, he collected rock and mineral specimens from in and around the mine's waste rock piles, and that led him to the study of geology. As a 1982 geoscience graduate from Penn State University, Mike worked for 36 years as a geologist, health physicist, and manager for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Geological Survey. After retiring from federal service, he returned to Cornwall, where he serves as a guide and researches the history of mining and geology of Cornwall and similar deposits in Pennsylvania. Mike is a weekly volunteer at the museum and gives guided tours of Cornwall Iron Furnace on most Fridays. He's also the author of Always More Production, the history of the mining operation at Cornwall, that is now available for sale at the Cornwall Iron Furnace Museum store. So please welcome our speaker, Mike Weber.
Thank you, Mike. Wasn't it a beautiful day today in central Pennsylvania? For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, I hope you also had a beautiful day wherever you are. But here in Cornwall, it was a gorgeous day. Well, good evening and welcome to another series of presentations, this being the first one, sponsored by the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates. It's my pleasure to lead off this series for 2024 with a presentation on the rest of the story. I'd also like to thank Cornwall Manor for hosting tonight's presentation. Nice to see a large audience here tonight. And to the associates for sponsoring this seminar, especially Mike Emery, Cornwall Site Administrator, Kathy Donaldson, who does a lot of behind-the-scenes coordination work in support of the Zoom calls, and also Bruce Chadbourne, our resident in the back, a videographer, researcher, writer. Bruce does it all. So, as many of you know, Cornwall Furnace is one of the best preserved and also one of the best documented charcoal furnaces in the world. And despite these accolades, some mysteries remain regarding the operation and the history of Cornwall Furnace from 1742 until 1883. Some of you may recognize the link between my title, The Rest of the Story, and the popular radio show by Paul Harvey, The Rest of the Story, from the 1970s until 2009. Now, Paul Harvey, you may know, loved history. And so that's why it fits into our seminar series tonight. And he often featured the backstory of the headline stories in his program called The Rest of the Story. So I plan to take a similar approach tonight and share the rest of the story associated with some of those mysteries that remain at Cornwall Furnace. Uh-oh. Maybe. There we go. First mystery solved, thanks. So after my brief introduction, I'll provide the historical context for my presentation this evening, highlight some of the mysteries, discuss how we are today attempting to resolve those mysteries, and then focus on the mystery of why Cornwall Furnace stopped operating in 1883. I plan to leave plenty of time at the end of my presentation to answer your questions and also listen to your comments. Page 2. It's okay if you didn't get that. That was a Paul Harvey. Now, you may have already recognized that this year, 2024, marks the 141st anniversary of the closure of Cornwall Furnace. That means that the furnace this year has been closed for as many years as it operated 141. The furnace went out of blast for the last time on February 11th, 1883. Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham, otherwise known on this slide as Mrs. Buckingham, donated the furnace to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1932. That was 92 years ago. 7 years later, on January 8th, 1939, the furnace opened for business for tours for guests that sought information about how the furnace worked and its history. So for about 85 years, we've been telling and fulfilling Mrs. Buckingham's vision for sharing the history and the story associated with the furnace. Now, Jim Polzinski, who's sitting with us in the front row tonight, president of the Cornwall Furnace Associates, made a presentation about telling the stories of the furnace in April of 2022. Jim emphasized in that presentation that museums are really storytellers and that they collate and share human experience. Well, that is certainly the case at Cornwall Furnace, where each of our tour guides shares the story of Cornwall Furnace in her or his own way. You might say that we share the stories of the furnace. We do not follow a standard script. Each guide decides on what and how information about the furnace should be shared in a way that helps our visitors get the most out of their visit to Cornwall Furnace. Now, these stories reflect a pretty good understanding of the history and the technology of how the furnace operated. This understanding is based on authoritative histories of the operation of charcoal iron furnaces in general, as well as specific historical descriptions of the operation of the Cornwall Furnace. However, despite our good understanding, mysteries remain about how the furnace operated and its history due to gaps in our knowledge of the furnace and its history. In today's information age, it can be difficult for us to appreciate how much we do not know about a facility that began operating 282 years ago. So during the operation of the furnace, no Discovery Channel documentaries were filmed. The furnace was not featured in Dirty Jobs, and we have no YouTube videos, Facebook stories, or TikTok shorts showing the operation of the furnace. The records that we do have include blast books, ledgers, journals, correspondence, and cordwood and coal books like those on this slide. Unfortunately, these records are incomplete, and they primarily pertain to financial operations and the finance of the furnace operations. You see, iron masters relied extensively on credit, both granting credit and borrowing on credit. And it could take years before the debts were settled between the furnace and the suppliers of various material and their workers. Consequently, it was important for the iron masters and their companies and the people with whom they worked to keep detailed and accurate records of the debts and credits. Were it not so, we may have even fewer records today and a much poorer understanding of the operation of Cornwall Furnace. So our incomplete knowledge of furnace operations and history give rise to historical mysteries. So, for example, and these are only examples, why did Peter Grubb lease the furnace in 1745 so soon after he completed its construction and began operating it in 1742? Did he tire so quickly of operating an iron furnace, or had he decided to move on to other frontiers in his career? Or another one, where was the water wheel that initially powered the bellows in the furnace, and what was its physical and mechanical relationship, if any, to the great wheel that we see today in the wheel room at the furnace? We can see the wheelhouse depicted in this illustration from the 1790s, but we cannot peer inside that drawing to see the water wheel itself. How about another one? When were the large leather and wooden bellows replaced by these wooden blowing tubs, which you see today at the furnace? As important as this upgrade must have been to the operation of the furnace, it is interesting that we cannot place a specific date for when that change was made. Now, part of the challenge with this mystery may be that the term bellows was used to apply to a variety of different machines that pumped air into the furnace, not necessarily bellows like we might think of bellows. What was the purpose of this stovepipe that penetrates from the roof of the wheelhouse? Okay, now obviously it was to allow smoke to be discharged from the wheelhouse. But what was the source of smoke in the wheelhouse, and why was it located in the wheelhouse? To what extent did the furnace and the surrounding iron plantation rely on enslaved and indentured workers? And how did this reliance change over the lifetime of the furnace? What were the lives like for the workers at the furnace and on the iron plantation? Okay, now here's a simpler one. What caused the stone stack at the furnace to crack between 1849 and 1883? Did this crack adversely affect the operation of the furnace? Or perhaps it occurred after the furnace closed in 1883. Here's another one. Why did the Colemans invest so much money in renovating and decorating the furnace in the 1850s and 60s? The Gothic Revival architectural style and the diamond-shaped windows seen here, the stone walls for the furnace, and the arches at the rear of the furnace were much fancier than was required for the furnace to operate properly. And why did the Colemans invest so much time and energy and money in these upgrades while in this older furnace, while simultaneously they were operating much newer and larger and more modern furnaces nearby in Cornwall and Lebanon? Okay, enough of the mysteries. So, these are only some of the mysteries that remain involving Cornwall Furnace. And remember, Cornwall Furnace is one of the best preserved, best documented furnaces. These mysteries illustrate some of the history that we are attempting to determine today by conducting research. Now, I'm not sharing with them to help you stump your tour guides at your next visit to the furnace. Many of the guides will be quick to point out, I don't know the answer, when these and other mysteries arise during the tours. The mysteries do, however, ignite within us a desire to expand our understanding of the knowledge and the history of Cornwall Furnace. For example, Brian Bachman, who's with us in the back, and Victoria Brumchuk, who's studying at school, have been identifying and characterizing the enslaved workers at Cornwall. Bruce Chadbourne, back there at the video camera, has been illuminating our understanding of the extended Coleman family. Jim Polzinski in the front row has been assessing the leadership of the Colemans and Grubbs in their iron dynasties. Mike Trump and L. Susan Wenzel have been researching the history and the evolution of the Cornwall communities. I've been doing research on the operation of the Cornwall Furnace and the mines, and working behind the scenes, quietly as site administrator, Mike Emery has been skillfully guiding these research projects to understand, to preserve, and to share the history of Cornwall Furnace. Now, you might be wondering why these mysteries continue to exist after 141 years and more. Well, just look up the information on the internet, right? Wrong. So most of the information we're accessing is not available on the internet, unfortunately, and has not been digitized. Some of the information has been lost over the ravages of time, if it was recorded in the first place. Some of the information exists in private collections, and private collections can be difficult to access. The rest of the information is divided up amongst various collections and institutions, including the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State Archives, the Lebanon County Historical Society, Maryland Court Records, Maryland Historical Society, the University of Michigan, and the Hagley Museum and Archives down in Delaware. Another challenge that we face is the extensive circulation of myths about the furnace, which lack a factual basis. These myths are what we might call today fake news. One classic case involving the Cornwall Furnace is the alleged visit of General George Washington to observe the initial casting of the cannon during the Revolutionary War. Jim Polzinski talked about this in his presentation back in April of 2022. It's a good story indeed, but the story lacks a factual basis. The alleged dates of the visit were October 26, 1776, and if that's not right, then it must have been October of 1778. Well, unfortunately, General Washington did not visit Cornwall Furnace, and certainly not on those dates. In October 1776, Washington was with his troops retreating from the British and preparing for the Battle of White Plains in New York, only 2 days later on October 28, 1776. And during October 1778, General Washington was with his troops stationed at his headquarters near the Connecticut border, about 70 miles north of New York City. So it's not clear when, who, or how the rumors of Washington's visit originated. Sounded good. But based on the records that we have access to today, General Washington did not come anywhere close to the Cornwall Furnace during both of those years. So now let's focus on a specific mystery to understand the rest of the story. If you tour the furnace today, we will tell you that Cornwall Furnace closed after beginning to lose money in the 1870s and finally closed in 1883 because of competition from hot blast furnaces and fundamental changes in the iron industry. Was the furnace operating if it wasn't making money? And what were these fundamental changes in the iron industry that forced the closure of Cornwall Furnace after 141 years of operation? Now, I should point out that before the furnace closed, Cornwall Furnace was the oldest continuously operated furnace in the United States. The Coleman family had invested a fair amount of money in renovating, upgrading, and decorating the furnace in the 1850s and the 1860s. The changes that ultimately culminated in the closure of Cornwall Furnace began in the 1830s. During the 18th century, iron furnaces like Cornwall were exclusively fueled by charcoal in the United States. So in the American colonies and later in the newly founded United States, timber was abundant and relatively inexpensive. Wood was used to produce charcoal, to extract iron and other metals. It was also used to produce gunpowder, build structures, and of course, heat homes and hearths. The wood was slowly charred in oxygen-poor structures to produce charcoal. And you can see that on this slide in the upper left. The availability of timber along the east coast of the United States became more restricted and in the early 19th century. The costs of harvesting trees and then producing charcoal from that wood began to increase after the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. The increase in the cost of charcoal provided an impetus to develop new technology to burn coal in iron furnaces. In contrast to charcoal, coal is a rock that is excavated from the earth. And in the bottom and the upper picture on the right side, you can see anthracite coal and bituminous coal, two types of coal. Coke, which you see in the upper right-hand corner, is a material, it's a fuel produced by roasting coal, and mostly bituminous coal. In the classic story of necessity driving innovation, various entrepreneurs and inventors attempted to use coal as the fuel in the iron furnaces. Problem was, it didn't work in furnaces like Cornwall. Coal and coke simply did not burn properly in those furnaces. Innovation had to develop hot blast technology by preheating the air that was injected into the furnaces, and that allowed the use of coal and coke as fuel. That research took place in the 1820s and 1830s. Several people experimented with burning coal in iron furnaces during this period, including a Lutheran minister named Geisenheiner in Schuylkill County. The successful experiments paid off, and they developed hot blast furnace technology. The new technology paved the way for the operation of the first commercial furnaces that were fueled by anthracite in Pennsylvania in October 1839, and shortly thereafter in April, May, June, and July of 1840. That's when the new furnaces burning anthracite came online. So you can see the rapid application of that new technology. In 1836, the Pennsylvania State Legislature was ahead of the curve and passed a law encouraging the use of coal and coke as fuel in iron furnaces by medium-sized corporations. And by the early 1850s, as much iron was produced using anthracite coal as was produced using charcoal. The charcoal fuel exceeded the costs of coke and coal. By the middle of the 19th century, charcoal iron cost $25 to $30 per ton to produce, whereas iron produced using coal cost $17 to $20 per ton. So these dramatic changes can be seen in the following two graphs. In this graph, I show the percent of iron produced in the United States between 1854 on the left and 1886 on the right by fuel type. Charcoal iron is depicted in blue, anthracite iron is depicted in yellow, and iron produced using bituminous coal and coke is depicted in that green curve. In 1854, on the left side of the graph, iron production was split fairly evenly between charcoal and anthracite coal, with bituminous contributing less than 10%. Over the next decade, anthracite coal dominated iron production, as you can see, as bituminous production then increased and ultimately exceeded charcoal production for the first time in 1868 after the close of the U.S. Civil War. While charcoal iron production continued to decrease, production of iron using bituminous coal rivaled anthracite production by 1875 and then dominated for the remainder of the period. The second chart focuses exclusively on charcoal iron production in the United States over the greater period from 1810 until 1887. You can see that charcoal was used exclusively as the fuel to produce iron during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. That's why it's humming along there at the top at 100%. After which the percentage of charcoal iron produced decreased dramatically. The percentage of iron produced using charcoal is plotted in this graph using the dashed blue line against the vertical axis on the right side of the chart. At the same time, the amount of iron produced using charcoal continued to increase, as seen by the orange line plotted against the vertical axis on the left. This is one of the paradoxes of iron production in the United States. Even though their market share continued to decrease year over year over year, many operators of charcoal furnaces emphasized instead just how the overall amounts of charcoal iron continued to increase. Now, some of the growth in charcoal iron production came from the western states, Michigan, Oregon, Washington. In those states, wood remained plentiful and coal was much more expensive. So nevertheless, in the eastern states where coal was much more readily available, particularly right here in Pennsylvania, it became increasingly difficult for the charcoal furnaces to compete by price and by capacity against the larger, more modern hot blast coal-fired furnaces. So as the competition escalated, charcoal furnace operators first turned their attention to replacing and upgrading outdated equipment. In 1881, in this editorial in the Journal of the U.S. Association of Charcoal Iron Workers, the editor stated, quote, "We have proclaimed to the world that charcoal iron workers are not dead, but had been sleeping. They had awakened to the realization of demands for improvement in processes and perfection of appliances," end quote. Of course, the coal-fired furnaces were more competitive because they were using more modern equipment and plants. Some furnace operators who were using charcoal attempted to boost their competitiveness by replacing or upgrading some of their older equipment. Some attempted to convert to hot blast designs, and some simply gave up, closed down their operations, and went out of business. The charcoal operators that remained in the competition argued that cold blast charcoal iron was actually preferred for certain applications, including railroad car wheels, seen here, boilerplate production, and piano wire. For example, some studies appeared to show that charcoal iron railroad wheels lasted longer in comparison to hot blast iron and steel wheels. Of course, these claims were being made before the establishment of the modern fields of metallurgy, mechanical engineering, and materials analysis. The claims prompted other stories that showed no difference in the wear of the railroad wheels, or that in fact hot blast iron and steel wheels outperformed charcoal iron. The end of the railroad building boom of the 1860s and 70s kind of mooted this debate. Eventually, the emerging academic fields improved our understanding of metals. Science and engineering demonstrated that the composition of the metal and the processes used in its production had a greater impact overall on the properties of the metal than whether it had been produced using coal or charcoal. Now, market conditions also dramatically impacted the price and demand for iron. Although market downturns affected the demand for both charcoal iron and coal iron, profit margins were tighter for the charcoal iron because it was more expensive to produce. Consequently, market downturns associated with the panics of 1873 and 1882, as seen on this slide, disproportionately impacted the production of charcoal iron in comparison with iron produced using coal. In addition, as transportation costs decreased throughout the 19th century and international markets opened up to foreign trade, iron imports competed against the production of charcoal iron in the United States. By 1849, iron cost twice as much to manufacture in the United States than in Great Britain because U.S. employers were paying the laborers twice as much. In addition, financing rates were less expensive in Great Britain to build new factories, and British technology at that time was ahead of U.S. manufacturing. After nearly 200 years of high and escalating duties that Britain imposed on imports of iron to Great Britain, Parliament eliminated those duties in 1846. And then in early 1883, the U.S. Congress enacted a reduced tariff on imported pig iron, which was signed by the president on March 3rd, 1883. Although this reduction was a boost for U.S. manufacturers, it adversely impacted iron producers like the Colemans and Cornwall Furnace. The collective impact of these changes can be seen in the rapid closure of charcoal furnaces in Pennsylvania. This graph depicts those closures of the older and longer lasting furnaces in Pennsylvania from 1850 until the beginning of the 20th century. The graph shows early closures first in that first band in the 1850s and 1860s as competition heated up between the furnaces. And then that band was followed by another in the post-Civil War period where bituminous coal and coke competition heated up. The most dramatic period of charcoal furnace closures in Pennsylvania occurred from 1880 until 1885. A total of 5 charcoal furnaces permanently went out of blast in Pennsylvania in 1883, including Cornwall Furnace. Looking at that in a little bit more detail, in early July 1881, Pennsylvania had 38 charcoal furnaces, of which 24 were in blast or in operation. Pennsylvania had the 3rd largest production of charcoal iron that same year, only behind production in the states of Michigan and Ohio. On January 1st, 1883, Pennsylvania had 25 charcoal iron furnaces in blast. This number dropped to 16 by July 1st and 13 by January of 1884. By January 1885, only 5 charcoal furnaces remained in blast in Pennsylvania. And by April 1888, the number of operating charcoal furnaces in the state dropped to only 3. During this entire period, Pennsylvania remained the dominant supplier of pig iron, producing only slightly less than half of the iron produced in the United States in 1888. And during the same period, charcoal iron production in the state of Pennsylvania fell from 3rd place down to 10th place amongst the states. By 1890, that same organization that we were introduced to before lamented, "The pioneers of our iron industry, the cold blast charcoal furnaces, are rapidly passing away, having outlived their usefulness. They were either entirely razed or give place to structures more modern in design and equipment," end quote. One of those pioneers is depicted here, the Hopewell Furnace in Union Township, Berks County. And this photo was taken in about 1920. And what of the Cornwall Furnace? How did these negative trends affect the profits or losses of the furnace? Well, historian Frederick Miller observed that Cornwall Furnace was a consistent money maker for the Grubbs and the Colemans over most of the operating lifetime of the Cornwall Furnace. Cornwall Furnace consistently, for example, achieved profits in excess of $10,000 during the 1840s. And these profits, while reduced, were still thousands of dollars a year in the 1850s. Profit and loss data for the furnace become less available during the remaining years that it operated. During the last year of the Civil War, with inflated prices, reduced market demand for iron, and large expenses associated with renovating the Iron Master's mansion right here at Cornwall Manor, the Cornwall Furnace recorded almost a $76,000 loss in 1865. Then in 1869, Artemus Wilhelm, who was managing the Cornwall Furnace for the Colemans, reported that the results of the furnace operation in 1868 were not as favorable as desired. A year later, in February 1870, he wrote again about plans to install a new hearth design in the furnace. In November 1872, Mr. Wilhelm reported that Cornwall Furnace produced 58 tons of iron in 2 weeks, and that was nearly a 100% increase in its overall production during the previous 20 years. On February 5th, 1874, Mr. Wilhelm wrote that the charcoal furnace was working extraordinarily well, was producing more per week than during the previous 25 years, and was also using about 30% less charcoal per ton of iron produced. By 1881, Robert Habersham Coleman received about $18,500 as income from Cornwall Furnace. So if you look at all the owners at that time, that would have translated to about a $90,000 profit in that year. The last accounting of revenues for the Cornwall Furnace was in 1883, the year that the furnace closed, and totaled a loss of about $5,000. Consequently, Cornwall Iron Furnace went out of blast at 11:30 a.m. on February 11th, 1883, 141 years ago, last month. The closure was prompted by increased costs associated with the use of charcoal as fuel, competition from the larger, more modern hot blast furnaces that use coal as fuel, increased imports of lower priced iron from Great Britain, and reduced profits for the operation of the furnace. You can see this picture is the actual last page of the blast book for Cornwall Furnace, which shows the time, date, and month that the furnace closed down. Now, as far as those other mysteries, well, we're still working to resolve those mysteries. So in my presentation this evening, I provided you with the historical context, the operation of the furnace, and the story of Cornwall Furnace, highlighted some of the remaining mysteries, discussed how researchers are attempting to resolve those mysteries by conducting research, and then reviewed the variety of factors that contributed to the closure of Cornwall Furnace when it stopped operating in 1883. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Furnace for allowing me to speak tonight, and particularly Mike Emery, Cornwall Site Administrator, Kathy Donaldson, Bruce Chadbourne for their support, as well as for Cornwall Manor for helping us to host tonight's presentation. And of course, I'd also like to thank the countless iron workers who enabled the charcoal ironworks to prosper in the United States for over 200 years. Now, after Mike allows me, I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have or listen to your comments. Thank you. Mike's grabbing his computer.
So right now we're looking to see if anyone does have questions for Mike regards to the talk. Currently, I'm not showing any questions on our chat, so I'll go ahead and open this up. What Mike's going to have to do, though, when you ask your question, he's going to have to say it back into the microphone so our folks at home can hear it. Otherwise, they're only going to hear his answers and not exactly what's coming through. So it will be possibly a little awkward, but that's the best way we can do it for everyone at home as well. So go ahead, Mike. I'll let you take over.
Back here. So the question is whether Cornwall Furnace ever adopted the Bessemer process for iron production. The answer is no. Cornwall Furnace only ever produced cast iron, and Bessemer process came out in 1850s about. So no, it wasn't used at Cornwall. Other questions here? Yes, ma'am. So the question is, where did the indentured workers come from? So the indentured workers came from Europe primarily, and that is why they were indentured, because they could not pay their transport to the colonies or to the newly formed United States. And so when they got off the ship in Philadelphia or New York, the ship captains sold them in an indenture. And so people who needed workers would show up at the docks and pay for their transport across the Atlantic. And then they would have to work off that indenture over a series of years by working for the furnace or for other employers. Yeah. Question? So the question is, what kind of products did they make at Cornwall Furnace during the Civil War? As much as I've seen, all they made were cast iron pigs by the Civil War. Now, of course, earlier in the history of the furnace made a wide variety of cast iron implements, hollowware, stove plates, etc. But by that time, in the lifetime of the furnace, all their product was pig iron. Yes, sir. Bless you. Is there any record of where the slaves lived? Yes, there are records. I know Mike's told this story. They did an inventory of stoves that were being used in the houses here that were being owned by the company. And one of those houses was identified as a dwelling for enslaved workers, and it had multiple stoves in it. So that was a clue that supported the understanding that that had been used for the enslaved workers. There were actually small communities throughout the Cornwall community that had a higher density of people who at one point might have been enslaved. For example, on the backside of Bird Coleman, you may be familiar with some of the old church back there and the old. Oh, you live across the street. Okay, so you know. Anything you wanted to add, Mike? No. Okay. So the question was, where's the house with the stove? Location unknown. Thanks, Mike. Yes, sir. Two. Yeah, so the question deals with the condition of the furnace at the time that it was transferred over to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1932, because of course the furnace closed in 1883. So you're looking at multiple decades there between the time it closed and when it was transferred. Actually, from what I've seen, the furnace was in good shape. The furnace remained on the grounds of the ironmaster's estate, and so the Coleman family took care of the furnace. I also know that Margaret Coleman invested some of her own money to clean up and prepare the furnace before it was transferred to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When you go through the furnace today, if you're observant, you can see some minor graffiti in places, and we know that some objects had been taken during that time period, but for the most part the furnace was in really good shape, and I know that the Commonwealth appreciated the condition in which the furnace was found. Yes, sir. So his question is, when did they discontinue the water wheel? I don't know. It's one of those mysteries. We know that the last 30 years or so that the furnace operated, it was using a steam engine. For the beginning period, say, for example, in the 1840s into the 1850s, they could run on steam or on water. And so at some point during that decade, they stopped using the water wheel, and from there on used the steam engine exclusively as the source of power for the blast apparatus. So his question is, is he correct in understanding that the mine did not stop operating until 1972? Almost. Because it stopped operating in June of 1973. Almost. Yes. So his question is, from how many miles away from Cornwall did the colliers eventually have to get their wood? I don't have a specific answer to that question. As far as I know, the charcoal was always delivered to the furnace using mule-drawn wagons or oxen-drawn wagons. That limited the distance that the charcoal could be transported, because after about 10 miles or so, the charcoal would break down so much that it no longer was worth very much. It was too fine to put into the furnace. We do know that they practiced reforestation, or they allowed the coppiced trees to regrow, and then in 20 to 25 years they would reharvest those trees. We are currently doing research by looking at the old coal and cordwood books. So ask me that question again in a year or two and we should have a better answer. We're also trying to map where the charcoal was being produced, because one of the nice things with those coal and cordwood books is they would document who owned the property on which the trees were harvested. Was it furnace land or was it private land? And then who prepared the charcoal, who was the collier, and then who delivered it back to the furnace. So in fact, later this week, I'm going to be going to the Lebanon County Historical Society to see if I can rustle up some older maps to map the names that we have in those books back to the actual locations where the coal was being produced. We do know there's one account of charcoal that was sent from the Lidditz area. That is the longest distance away from the furnace that I'm aware of. But again, more research to follow. Mystery in progress. See, back here. So his question is, was it about 10 acres of wood converted to charcoal a day? The answer is more like 1 acre per day when the furnace was in blast. And that's very approximate because, we don't really know the density of wood that was in the first growth forests when they first were harvesting the wood. So that's a rough approximation by looking at a variety of different densities of trees and of other factors. Yes, sir. His question is, was the water wheel in the same place that the big wheel is now? And my answer to that question is probably. But the water wheel, if you go back, maybe I can go back. Ooh. There. So we think this illustration came from the 1790s. And if you notice from the right side of that slide, you see a flume that's bringing the water into the wheelhouse. If that was the orientation, then the water wheel, as an overshot water wheel, would have been oriented east-west. The great wheel in the wheel room today, or the wheel building, is oriented north-south. Now, it's possible that you could have powered the great wheel with the water wheel with that orientation, but it would have been a little bit difficult to do that. So my thought is remaining to be validated with actual research, is that the water wheel at some point was moved from being east-west to north-south parallel with the great wheel. And then at a certain point, they no longer needed the water wheel, so they could reorient the great wheel. I don't think I said that right. So the great wheel would have also been east-west, right? And that room is large enough that they could have rotated the great wheel and the water wheel with some masonry to take care of the tail race that's there today. But these are the mysteries that we're trying to solve. And it just goes to show you that history is alive, right? You come to a historical building, a facility like the Cornwall Furnace, and you think, oh, all these answers must have been known years and years and years ago. Well, no, it's not so. Unfortunately, they didn't really document much of the operation of the furnace. And so we have to put the story together from using less direct evidence. There's a question back here, yes.
Yeah, maybe this, I guess what struck me is I'm fascinated by the idea that reforestation. Well, I think it's very easy to think that in the past, they just, for lack of a better word, like slash and burn and moved on, but it seems like there's a kind of vision, if you will. So my specific question is, did they decide when they're doing a reforestation project on a specific kind of tree to plant that would give them an end result that they desired? Because it strikes me that, well, first growth forests are a lot different than secondary and tertiary.
Right, right.
And first growth forest probably had a dominant species, and you have to redominate. Well, I'm just making that question along.
Yeah, so I'll simplify your question and you'll steer me straight. So he's amazed at the notion of reforesting the timberlands that were cut down to produce the charcoal. And today, when we think about reforestation, we think about actually going and after the trees are clear cut, planting new seedlings and allowing those seedlings to grow up. They were more pragmatic back at that time. And generally what we know happened is that they coppiced the trees. So if you're familiar with that technology, they would cut the trees off anywhere from 3 to 4 feet above the ground level. And then with the root structure intact, they would allow the tree to grow back. If you look at, and I'm giving you a preview of coming attractions, but my talk that's going to be in November will be all about charcoal. And so in the charcoal milers, or in the pits that they use to make the charcoal, they really wanted wood that was no bigger than about 4 to 6 inches in diameter. So by coppicing the trees, what would happen is sprouts would grow up from the trunks. And after 20 to 25 years, they would be able to go back and harvest those sprouts, now much larger, and use that as the primary source of wood that they were putting into the milers. C-O-P-P, question was, could I spell coppice? The answer is yes. It's C-O-P-P-I-C-E, coppice. Yep. Actually, at this time in the 1880s, there was a movement in the United States to really begin to practice forestry like we think about it today. Yeah, Gifford Pinchot. And so people were going from the United States back to Europe, who of course had faced this challenge centuries before when they ran out of wood, so that they could learn how could you responsibly manage a forest so that you don't run out of the resource that you're trying, and you at the same time protect the environment. Yeah, so the question is, what was the best tree that they preferred? They cut all the trees and they used them all. Now, they tried to steer away from old wood, rotted wood, knotted wood, like trunks, and certain trees just have all kind of gnarly, like dogwood has all kind of, they liked straight wood. Some colliers, some furnace men preferred hardwoods, but others preferred a mix of hard and soft wood because they thought it burned in the furnace in a more predictable way. So our question was there no species that was more efficient, right? And the answer is no. Now, we know today from applying science that certain woods produce more dense wood, and that dense wood can produce more dense charcoal. So there are benefits with harvesting certain woods, but they didn't have that luxury at the time. They needed all the wood that they could get. So, yes, sir. Okay. So his question is, how far would the cannons that they manufactured here at Cornwall Furnace shoot the cannonball or the shell, and what was the weight of the cannonballs? So the guns that were manufactured during the Revolutionary War here at Cornwall were 12-pounders. And that means that the weight of the cannonball was 12 pounds. Now, as far as the distance that you could throw a 12-pound cannonball, I don't have that off the top of my head, but remember, these were naval guns. So they were trying to get within a couple hundred yards of the enemy to engage in combat. I don't know, Mike, whether you have any other. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering whether or not they were involved in making it, or whether they were making it for themselves. But there is a huge limestone kiln in Schuylkill County, right next to where Lebanon County has a hybrid reservoir. And you don't want to take a trip to see it's there. Otherwise, you can go down the hallway by the exercise, and you'll see one the photograph on the wall.
Well, thank you. So he was asking initially about the limestone kilns and whether the farmers manufactured their own lime or whether they used those to make charcoal. Is that what your question was? Yeah. So the limestone kilns were very important in this area. The farmers realized soon after they arrived that they needed to add lime to their soil so they could continue to grow crops on the soil. Otherwise, after 6 or 7 years, the nutrients were depleted in the soil and they wouldn't get as large a yield from those fields. So the farmers did build limestone kilns and they roasted limestone and produced lime in those kilns, and then they spread that on the ground, and that's how they took care of their immediate needs. Now, of course, with the passage of time, then other nutrients also became depleted, so they had to rotate crops and they had to add phosphates and nitrogen and other chemicals in order to sustain the large crop yield that we have today here in Lebanon and Pennsylvania. Mike?
An announcement first and then so written around
Okay. So Mike was just reminding us that Rick Browse reminded him that because there's a lot of interest in this room and probably online about charcoal, they'll be doing the next charcoal burn at Hopewell National Historical Site on May 11th. It'll be the lighting, and that usually goes about a week before the charcoal burn's done, and then they harvest the charcoal. That's a smaller miler than the full-scale ones.
So the first question, when you listed records,
So Mike's first question online was, why is Maryland the location of some of the records that have to do with Cornwall Furnace? Remember, one of those mysteries that I identified early on was, why did Peter Grubb lease the furnace for operation 3 years after he began operating the furnace and completed its construction? The first owners of that lease for 20 years were from Maryland. And so from 1745 until 1765, there were a group of merchants that changed over time, but there were legal disputes. And so because of the cases being heard in Maryland courts, the records pertaining to the operation of the furnace ended up in the legal files in the state of Maryland. And I don't know whether you want to add anything. Is that good? We are, in fact, at the beginning of this presentation, not during the presentation, but as we were gathering, we were talking about records that we recently received through Brian Bachman, who's in the back of the room, from a colleague that he's established down in Maryland. So this is another part of resolving these mysteries by gaining access to records that we didn't know about previously, and now we're trying to track them down so we can better understand the early years that the furnace operated. Bless you. Maybe I should have the gentleman who asked the question. The question was about the Bessemer process, and the Bessemer process, as I understand it, is a process to make steel by melting down iron in a Bessemer converter and then blasting oxygen through the liquid iron. That process then lowers the carbon concentration and can produce steel in large quantities in a fairly straightforward process. Is that a fair summary explanation? So before that, of course, they could make steel, but they could only make it in very small quantities, not here at Cornwall Furnace, but at other furnaces and steelworks in the colonies. So they made crucible steel and blister steel, where basically they would produce wrought iron and then take that wrought iron back up in its carbon concentration so that they could produce steel. And the way they did that is they immersed the wrought iron in charcoal, and slowly through a week or so, the carbon would migrate back into the iron, and then they could produce steel. But Bessemer's process came along, and I'm not getting the other gentleman's name. Kelly, Bessemer and Kelly. I think the explanation is they came up with a process at about the same time. Is that right? Co-invented. Okay, thank you. So Bessemer and Kelly co-invented this process. I've been referring to it simply as the Bessemer process, but I should perhaps give credit to the other inventor. And that then enabled the production of steel on much larger scales. And so steel became much more readily available.
Here's an interesting question. Which process, charcoal or coal, produces less nitrogen, or did they care? Was it just about wrong?
So the question was, which process, whether it was charcoal fueled or coal fueled, produced less smoke from the furnaces? And the second part of it is, did they care? And the answer, from what I can have access to, is they really didn't care. They were trying to make something, and that something was very much in demand for the residents of the colonies. And so it was, you know, bring it on. We need all the iron we can get. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's true. One of the gentlemen in the audience pointed out that you have less smoke with anthracite coal than you do with bituminous coal. Right. Yes.
So this is from
Okay. So Henry Deemer is asking about the coincidence of the dates between when the furnace was modified back in the 1850s and 60s and when the Grubb Mansion was modified, which is now the Buckingham Mansion right here on Cornwall Manor. And Jim Polzinski wants to answer that question.
Okay.
Watch the cord. Watch the cord.
Thank you. So the simple answer is R.W. Coleman. That's the one thing that's in common. So R.W. Coleman was the leader of the Coleman family in Cornwall during that time period. He was also a brilliant iron master. He was a visionary. So he was the leader of the family, which included his sisters and his brother, who played more of a supporting role in his leadership of the furnaces and the family's time. Not only did they renovate the Cornwall Manor here, but they also had plans drawn up, and they built the stables that are that direction. A number of improvements there. He bought Donamore Furnace. He expanded their operations. So basically he made all the decisions mostly, and his family went along with him because he was usually right and he made them a lot of money. So that's the common factor.
Good, thanks. I'll watch it. It's also an infomercial for our next month presentation, which Jim Polzinski will give on the Colemans and the Grubbs, right? Oh, wait, there's more.
I don't make a mistake. So Mike had mentioned to me that Cornwall Manor is celebrating a really great anniversary. And the original talk was, I had said to Mike, well, I think what might be a good topic is the Happy Nine, which is going to be the topic, which will go through the fourth generation of so Robert Coleman's great-grandchildren. So it'll go through that fourth generation, their lives, and how what they did ended up benefiting essentially everybody who lives at Cornwall Manor, as well as the rest of the community. So the topic's going to be the Happy Nine, but it will actually probably contain a lot of what was in the original little blurb.
Okay. All right. Other questions?
What was the origin of coal used by the other furnaces and by the
So the question is, what was the origin of the coal that was used by the other furnaces that were operated by the Colemans? A lot of it came from Schuylkill County, and it was anthracite coal. We have a question back there, Mike. So the question is, how many Coleman families did Cornwall support? Well, it started with Robert Coleman, and he had 11 children. No, it was Robert Coleman. Robert first. Yeah. How many families, how many Coleman families did Cornwall support?
Furnace, how many did it support? The Coleman family.
So it really is Thomas Bird Coleman. But there's a lot of explanation about that. You have to go into the. You don't mind like that.
Yeah, no, I don't mind.
So it's a tricky question because, I mean, Robert Coleman, he had, when he died, there were 4 living sons. And the daughters all got like different properties, various places. But the sons, the 4 sons got the ore pit and they got various operations, different furnaces. But 2 of the sons decided very quickly, they'd been working for their father for 30 years. It was time to retire from this business. So they sold their holdings to the combination of James Coleman from out in Brickerville, Elizabeth Furnace, and Thomas Bird Coleman. So they shared ownership for a period of time, but Robert Coleman died in 1825. James Coleman died in 1831. So then there was a legal separation between the descendants of James Coleman and Thomas Bird Coleman. So that's how Cornwall came to be dominated by Thomas Bird Coleman and his line. So really the furnace mostly supported the Thomas Bird Coleman line as time went forward. And there were 9 children, grandchildren of Thomas Bird Coleman. And he had 2 sons and he had 3 daughters that would have lived to enjoy. In fact, actually, for a long period of time, while R.W. Coleman was leading, then when he died, his 3 sisters basically took over the leadership of the area, and they were actually called the Ladies by Wilhelm. So anyhow, so that those are the families that got supported. So the Aldens, the Freemans, and the Colemans.
Much better than I could have done. Yeah.
Just a couple more questions. The question was, how did the composition work?
That's it?
Well, that's good.
Okay, so the question is, how did the composition of the workforce change over the decades? And I presume it's the operational period that the Cornwall Furnace was operating. The workforce did change, but that's some of the research that we're still doing. We know, for example, that enslaved workers at one point were up to about 1/3 of the workforce on the iron plantation. And then in addition, you had the indentured workers, and then you had free workers. And initially, the furnace was largely led by English, Irish, and Scotch founders and iron masters. And then over time, the workforce diversified more and blended more. So you got a better mix of people in there, including the Pennsylvania Germans, Irish. And then if we go into the mines, You get even greater diversification. You have a Mexican contingent that comes. You have African Americans that join the workforce. And then later in the years, especially when they went underground in the mining, you had Eastern European and Italian miners that came, as well as miners that came from the Midwest, who had already gained experience in doing underground mining and could use that experience in applying it here at Cornwall. So that's a bit of a ramble of an answer, but beyond that, I'd say we're still doing that research.
Do we know the original
Furnace building. So the question is, do we know the original cost to build the furnace building as it stands now? My answer is no. I don't know. I think we still need to do research on that. Yes. So the question is, the Cornwall Furnace is a beautiful building. Was it inspired by architecture in Europe? The stone walls that you see today in the furnace were built in 1855, 1856 for the most part. And at that time, Gothic revival was all the rage here in the United States. So the Colemans used that architectural style in telling their masons how to build the new buildings, which of course replaced older wooden structures. And that's why they're as beautiful as they are today. Far more than would be required to operate a furnace. But we're indebted to the Colemans for spending the money and building those beautiful structures. As a guide at the furnace, we often have people that will come through and say, oh, I saw the monastery in Cornwall. And say, well, there's a furnace in Cornwall. I don't think there's a monastery in Cornwall, but it's inspired by that same Gothic look. Yes, sir. Right. So the question is, the creek that supplied the water for the wheel, which is Furnace Creek, when was that redirected away from the furnace? So the initial diversion of the creek was to an impoundment that's at the top of that sluice that you see, or that chute. That was when the furnace was initially constructed between 1739 and 1742. Now, that furnace, the Furnace Creek, flowed between Big Hill and Middle Hill. And so once mining progressed to the extent that it started getting close to the creek, they had to divert the creek, or else it would have flowed right into the mine works, and that would have aggravated their extraction of the ore. So for many years, that creek was diverted through a 48-inch culvert that ran around the open pit. And then once mining ended at Cornwall in 1973, then that culvert was detached from the source of water, and ever since, Furnace Creek flows into the lake, Miners Lake, in the large open pit, and then discharges on the other side near the PRL company, and then flows back into Furnace Creek past the furnace. So that was a long answer to a straightforward question, but I hope you got out of it what you were looking for. Yes. 20 years. He did. Without a will. Yeah.
And so, okay, I mean, Peter will go down and start on the Curtis.
No, but go ahead, finish your question.
My question is, what do you do? Managing the mining over here and not so much the Curtis, or
Okay, so his question is, what were the Grubbs doing once Peter Grubb Sr. leased the furnace and the ore deposit out to this company from Maryland for 20 years? The lease required that the company paid the Grubbs 160 pounds sterling every year. So they were making money off of the furnace operations. Peter Grubb, I believe, moved back down to Chester County or Delaware County and started doing real estate deals, as I recall. Meanwhile, Curtis Grubb and Peter Grubb Jr. stayed up here in the area to keep their eyes on the operation of the furnace. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Mike.
It's a period really that we don't know a whole lot about what the Grubbs were. I know one of the things that I've thought more and more about this time is that we talk a lot about the Grubbs and we talk a lot about the Colemans, but one of the people that oftentimes we don't really talk enough about is Jacob Giles, who's the person who ends up with the money. You know, one of the reasons why I think Grubb rents out or leases out the furnace, he didn't have the capital. He needed to go ahead and spread that out. That's why he got 12 investors to go ahead and to come into it. You know, just like today, if you start up industry, it's not something that you can do on the cheap. And there isn't the banking system to go ahead and to get the loans. So the best way that you can secure capital is with people. So the person who ends up really getting a lot of that capital is a guy by the name of Jacob Giles, who's a merchant who's living in Harford County, Maryland. And he becomes kind of the primary leaseholder, I think, by 1752. And in many ways, had he driven this kind of into the ground, I don't know if we would have had the Grubbs taking this over, because they wouldn't have had the money to do it either. And they certainly didn't have the access to markets. And you know, this is a man who had his own merchant fleet that was down in that area. Giles did. So, you know, in many ways, I think that, you know, that's one of the names that we don't talk enough about. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question or the statement was really about the technology and what it needed to be used. That yes, it's only a very few people that have good working knowledge of how to make iron, and it's trade secrets. It's not out there on the internet. There aren't great books that are out there that do it. So this is knowledge that's being passed, you know, within families. That's why oftentimes when you look at who are iron masters' children marrying, other iron masters' children, you know, they're not only keeping wealth, but they're keeping trade secrets kind of together. So, you know, so we know more about Giles really in that time period. And we're still learning about that in this period in which Curtis and young Peter Grubb come. But when they then take over the furnace in 1765, they're relative babes in the woods when it comes to the operation. So in many ways, they rely on the workforce, the management, the processes that are already in place from Giles, who was running furnaces in forges down in that area of Maryland, in northern Maryland. So like I said, he's a person that kind of gets a little short shrift because he wasn't local and wasn't an owner. But in many ways, you know, the Grubbs and the Colemans really, you know, are the ones that get to benefit from everything that he did in the furnace as well. So we're going a little bit long on this. So what I'll do, and thank you, a lot of intensive questions here about the furnace. Now, the great news for all of you is that if you have more questions, Mike is at the furnace practically every Friday giving tours. So if you're going to go ahead and come on a Friday and you need a tour, more than likely, Mike is going to be the one to give it to you. So if you have additional questions, it's wonderful. We're not real busy yet this time of the year. The school trips haven't happened, so if you have until Friday, yeah, they are coming, but you know, not as many. We do have one on Friday. So, so thank you all for joining us for the lecture tonight. I especially want to thank Mike Weber for his presentation, for Bruce Chadbourne for helping to organize our virtual talk. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored the program, and Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use this wonderful space. And please join us for our next lecture on Tuesday, April 9th, when Jim Polzinski, who helped us out tonight. We did a lot of tag teaming here, so thank you, Jim. He's the president of the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, and he will speak about the Happy Nine, which again are these grandchildren of Thomas Bird Coleman, who really influenced this Cornwall community. So just a reminder, the museum is open on Friday and Saturday and Sunday for tours, and please check out our website for details for our tour information. So please stay safe and good night. Thank you all for coming out tonight.